Greetings, and welcome to the How We Do Digital Ministry podcast. I'm Christopher Harris of Faith Growth. You can find us online at faithgrowth.com, where we help our church clients build their digital presence and engage their communities online. On this podcast, I have a conversation with a church leader and ask them to share how they do digital ministry in their community. Today, I am talking with Christen Kinard. Christen, please introduce yourself and tell us how you do digital ministry.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited for this conversation. I was working through my notes earlier, and I very rarely get to talk with colleagues in the field because you are a colleague. I am the founder of Digital Congregations, and Digital Congregations is a business, but also a ministry. My ministry is to churches, and it is to come alongside them and help them figure out how to do ministry online, exactly what you have been talking with other people in this field about. I guess you could call me a communications consultant for churches. That's the nugget of what I do, but it looks like many different things. And the thing that I love most about what I do is conversations like these with ministers, church leaders, lay leaders, volunteers, even just congregants across the country about what's possible for the church in this digital age and what this period in the church's life has woken us up to in terms of hope and possibility and growth and reach. So I have those conversations day in and day out, but they never cease to be fascinating and exciting and hopeful to me. I work mostly with small to medium-sized churches. I think that's important to know that I do approach my business as a ministry. I want to serve churches, and I want to serve churches like the ones that I grew up in. And I didn't go to big churches. I went to smallish churches, ones that had limited resources and had to make tough decisions sometimes about what they could or couldn't do based on what they were feeling called to do. So another thing that I think is important that your listeners know about me, and then we're definitely going to stop talking about me because that is not the important part of this, is that I don't believe that this movement into digital ministry is limited to larger churches. I really believe that effective digital ministry can be done by churches of all sizes and resourced in all ways. I don't just believe that. I've seen it in the time that I've been since I started Digital Congregations. I've seen it happen over and over again. So at the very top of this conversation, I just want to dispel the myth that some have that somehow this digital ministry thing is only for the churches that have maybe multi-person communication staffs and all the technology in the world. I guess in terms of your question, how do I encourage churches to approach digital ministry? I was so excited when you reached out to see the very title of your podcast, How We Do Digital Ministry. That word is so important. And I think that too sets me apart from some consultants in this field. Yes, I am in the field of marketing and communications. I talk about digital communications with churches all day, every day, except that in using these digital tools, I believe that our goal, our objective, what we are called to do in the digital space is ministry, not marketing. And I think that's where most churches have gone wrong, where they've misstepped, is they're using these tools for marketing to tell people about the things that they're doing and when and where. But I want them to talk about who they are as a church community and why they do what they do. And that's the ministry part of this. So I would say that's my approach to teaching and to helping churches learn to do this digital ministry thing, is to actually just focus on the ministry.
Yeah, I like that. And I would agree with all of that. And I'm excited to have you as a guest today. So thank you for being here. And I look forward to our conversation as it's going to unfold. Let's start with one of my favorite question I like to just ask everybody up front is, tell me about an experience or maybe a story or a time where you've seen God at work or encountered God at work online.
I loved this question when you sent it to me, and I have had the joy of hearing so many stories and even seeing them transpire of presence, divine presence and encounter in the digital space. It was hard to come up with just a couple of examples, but I do have a couple that I want to share.
Good.
One in Florida and one in Alaska. I work with churches all over the country. So there's a church in Florida that had just started right before the pandemic. And they got up and running and then had to make the move to online only. And they've been online only this whole time. They're hoping to reopen in the new year, but they haven't yet. Mm-hmm. They discovered about halfway through their digital ministry that there was a group of truckers who had been worshiping with them twice a week, not just on Sunday morning, every week. And this group, they couldn't go to a service on Sunday morning. Most of them were on the road. Most of them had some sort of not great experience with the church growing up, or they didn't feel comfortable going to sort of quote unquote more normal church or traditional church. And they found in this particular church's digital ministry, not just the flexibility of online worship and of digital connection, but also just a new approach to being the church that was really appealing to them, that met their needs. And so the way that they discovered that this group of truckers was worshiping with them is because they started to talk about going back to or returning to in-person worship. They were just starting to feel out what that was going to look like. And this group got really worried that they were going to take away their online worship because it had become so important to them as a group. So that was just one example. Another example, kind of similar, but I think it speaks to the importance of this new ministry that many churches have developed more recently. This one from Alaska. A woman who began pastoring her church during the pandemic in a small Alaskan town. And frankly, she didn't really see a whole lot of growth potential. It was a small town, and the people who had been at that church for a while. And that wasn't a problem. She just saw that as kind of, okay, that I'm going to minister to the people who are here. But she quickly did decide that they needed an online worship experience. So she started having really intimate worship experiences online where she would ask someone from the church to submit a recorded prayer, or she would sit kind of close to the camera and deliver a sermon in a very casual, intimate way. So it created for the people who were worshiping with her a real bond to her as a new pastor. Similarly to my earlier story, she began talking about, well, do we want to return to in-person worship? And one day she got an email from someone she didn't know who literally said, I cannot ever walk into a physical church. I can't. It would be too difficult. I can't tell you what happened, but that is not something that I can do. But you have reconnected me with my higher power through your online worship. You are my pastor, even though you didn't know my name until I sent you this email. Please continue being my pastor, continue offering this type of experience online for people like me. And so what this pastor decided is that she wasn't just going to go to a traditional live stream, because it turns out this woman wasn't the only one in the town that felt that way. She had actually connected with other people who felt deeply uncomfortable or unable to walk into a church building, but who had rediscovered the faith of their childhood. And so she is adapting her digital ministry in a way that is uniquely suited to those people as well. She's essentially offering an in-person worship experience and a totally different worship experience for those who need her to minister to them online. But it just goes to show we can reach people we were never able to reach before as soon as we hit that record button. And frankly, I believe that the Holy Spirit is in that and is not just can, is speaking to people in new ways that really just brings me a lot of hope and joy. So those were two stories that came to mind as I was thinking about this podcast.
Both great stories. Thank you. Well, and that does, as I've been thinking about, especially your second story about the minister in Alaska, it does make me wonder sometimes, hybrid church, as some are calling it, like a traditional live stream, and we're going to, have some people online, some people here. It seems like it could be hard to put together in some instances for some churches, and maybe doing two separate experiences like that will allow you to connect better.
Yeah.
I know a church in California that's doing it that way as well. Has she found that not only is she meeting those needs of those people that really need to keep that community, has she found that it's easier for her to put together doing it separately, or does she have any of those insights?
Yes, she and I kind of worked on that. That was one reason she reached out to me, because we all are faced with the reality that we have limited time in the day. We can't do everything that we did before the pandemic and everything that we developed during the pandemic. That's just not possible. So she and I did work out ways that she could make this sustainable and manageable. I think so many churches are defaulting to the live stream because yes, you need the technology. Yes, you may need some additional, hands to run the technology, but you're not having to create two worship experiences entirely. The system that she and I worked out is that we're keeping it short, right? I think something just for the digital space can be much shorter. She also wanted to keep that intimacy. So she asked her pianist to just record herself when she was practicing one song during the week in preparation for the in-person worship. She then just pre-records herself having a moment of meditation. And then what she told me is she uses the notes from her sermon that don't make it in the final version. So it's not the sermon itself, but it's material she was working on anyway. And so she has found that was a sustainable way. I really don't think the Facebook video that she puts out there is any longer than 30 minutes. It's abbreviated. I want to speak to your point, though, that hybrid can mean different things to different churches, and it should mean different things to different churches. It is not true that there is one way to be an effective hybrid church. It is not true that you have to have a live stream service from your sanctuary on Sunday morning to be an effective hybrid church. Lots of churches will find that is right for them, and that is what they're being called to do. But I want churches with more limited resources, or perhaps with groups of people whose needs are not met by a live stream of that kind, to think a little more creatively, because the possibilities are almost endless in the digital space.
Yeah. Well, I like what you shared about, as she tried to figure this out, because she does have limited time, resource, and everything. I think it was wise that she used still some of those things that she was prepping for the in-person Sunday. So asking the piano player, when you're practicing, make one recording using the same sermon prep. It wasn't a different prep. It was the same, so I would assume she was going to do that prep anyways, and then letting it take a little bit different form based on the differences in the medium or experience. And I think that's wise. And I think that's, but I think that's a lot of it for us right now is, or at least something that I teach, and be curious your kind of thoughts, is sometimes when I'm speaking with a church leader for the first time, they're very overwhelmed by the technology itself. And I try to basically tell them, no, you've been taught how to do ministry. Don't worry about the technology. First of all, we'll get to that in a second. You were really taught how to do ministry, in seminary and other training that you've had. But technology changes all the time. So
it's so
really,
true.
You've been producing this content. It's like, now how do we publish it digitally, if you will? And knowing that that's going to kind of always be up, and as much as you master it today, it's going to change in a couple of months or a couple of years. So it's like, to me, it's about creating, looking at how have we always done ministry. We know how to do ministry, and then now how can we distribute over the digital tools? I don't know, that's kind of how I approach this. How are you working with churches to help them get more comfortable publishing more online? Let me say it that way.
Sure. I make fun of myself when I'm teaching and consulting because my answer to almost every question is, well, it depends, but it really does depend on the church. I think because I focus on ministry, I am not convinced that the needs of those who are worshiping online and plan to do so in the long term are always the needs of those people who are showing up in person. I think there's some overlap. I think sometimes they're the same, but I don't think they're always the same. And so my starting point is always, let's figure out who's worshiping with you online. Let's figure out how long they intend to do that. And then let's identify their needs, both in worship and in other parts of church life and your ministry. And let's make decisions that not just are geared toward meeting their needs, but also align with your calling as a church.
Mhm.
I keep it focused on the ministry piece. So that's my starting point. That takes us in different directions, depending on the church and depending on their congregation. Sometimes just answering the question, who's worshiping with us from home or online, is a tough one to answer. And that takes us time to figure out. So that's my starting point. Yes, I think they are already creating the content. It is not a question of content, but I don't know that all content needs to be online. Let's figure out what the need is, who those people are, and then what content meets their needs, and then figure out where to publish it, where to plug it in.
I like that, because I mean, you're starting with the people that you're called to serve, which that
Yeah.
um, sometimes we forget that. We get caught up into either the technology itself or just the programs, or
Yes.
and it really should start with those people that God is calling us to serve.
I
Uh,
think it's important that you said it that way, though. The people God is calling us to serve, because I also think there's a danger on the other side of this, that churches feel like they have to do everything for everyone, serve everyone. Not every church is set up the same, called to do exactly the same type of ministry, called to meet the same needs. So that piece of aligning with your calling, knowing who God has called you to serve, is such an important part of this conversation. So it's two parts, right? Identifying the needs, but then making sure that you're set up to meet those needs. And if not, helping them find another church that is set up to help them meet their needs. I think that's an important piece too.
yes, I agree. So tell me, what are I mean, I know it is contextual and it does depend on things. But for a church that's right now, they've been doing something online, they're trying to figure out how does that, either we continue or how does that change as we're coming back in person. Um, what advice are you giving out along those lines right now for churches that are just questioning and trying to figure out, what's, at this stage of pandemic, what's next, if you will?
Yeah. Gosh, it is tough. And I know most churches I've spoken with find themselves caught between two parts of their congregation, one that is desperate to get back in person and one that is simply not ready. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is not just practical, not just technical, not just, what additional pieces of technology do we need and how can we improve our stream? And it's not just that, it's how do we honor both parts of our congregation equally? And I think that is maybe the most important work that I'm doing right now, because it is very normal, very normal. And there's no shame here, because it is absolutely normal for a church that goes back to in-person worship to favor those and the worship experience of those who show up in the pews, because that's the default. That's what we've been doing for so long. That is what our physical space even is set up to do.
Yes.
But we have to recognize that if we don't make adjustments to the in-person service, even small adjustments like looking at the camera directly to communicate to the people at home that we know they're there and we love them, even small adjustments. But if we don't make them, then what we're effectively communicating, whether we intend to or not, is that the worship the online worship experience in our minds is secondary, and that the people who are worshiping from home, to quote one of my class participants, they're second class citizens. And a lot of churches are making unknowingly, I don't think this is intentional, but unknowingly communicating that to their at-home congregation. So the most important work I'm doing right now is figuring out who those people are, yes, what their needs are, and then how do we honor them both equally and honor their worship experiences equally through, big things like buying the right technology and little things like looking directly into the camera. But we need to have those conversations right now. Otherwise, my fear is that, and not just fear, my experience tells me that the end result will be further isolation of those who are at home. And we don't want that. That's not what we're working toward. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, but that's really at the heart of what I've been doing right now.
Well, no, that does. And I think, where you started was an important point that I want all pastors to hear right now about that, what you said, that all your churches are, there is a faction that's ready to come back and a faction that still needs to stay home. And there's lots of reasons there. Because that is, I hear from a lot of pastors and some of the Facebook groups I'm involved in and things, there's a level of fatigue out there. And and I think that in that fatigue, I think is coming from kind of like they're having to work with these two factions. And I think it's good to know that, hey, this is, you're not alone. Everybody's experiencing that. And it's an experience that we haven't experienced before. So we don't have the best answers. But we're, through, like when you're working with your churches and, you're working them through a process to try to come up with a solution. But it's, it's a new solution, there isn't teaching on this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We're figuring it out as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. I want to speak to 2 points there. The first, I just want to share a story. So in one of my classes, it's called How to Be a Hybrid Church. It's a 3-part series. And I send out a pre-course survey, basically to just help me get a feel for the churches that are participating in their sort of pandemic experience, where they find themselves, the things that they're struggling with, because I want to make sure that my class is helpful. And I know that every church comes at it from a different experience and perspective. Part of that survey is a ranking system. And I basically have indicated the various parts of church life, everything from spiritual formation to worship to children's ministry. And I asked churches to rank themselves. Now, I've taught this course up at least 12 times, and maybe more than that, since March of this year. To a T, within 3 points on a scale of 0 to 100, every group of churches has ranked themselves the same for every part of their church's ministry.
Wow.
It has been, I did not anticipate getting that kind of data out of this experiment, but it has blown my mind. The ranking is the same. The 2 things that swap every now and then are sometimes a group of churches tells me that they feel that they are doing better at spiritual formation than congregational care. Sometimes those 2 swap. But other than that, within 3 points, the ranking stays the same and where they rank themselves stays the same. Churches are not alone in this. You are all feeling the same things, facing the same problems. Yes, it depends. Yes, everything is contextual and circumstantial, but we're feeling the same thing. And again, I had no intention of figuring this out through my little pre-course survey that I send out, but this represents hundreds of churches across the country. And the data is so consistent.
Wow.
I know, isn't that crazy?
Well, I mean, that's what, I like that you have some data, I would have, intuitively, I would have said that's the case, but I like that not only can you speak to that with the data. I think it's crazy though, but I do think it speaks to where we're at. We're in some uncharted territory, and I mean, between an uncharted territory with a pandemic, uncharted ministry territory plus the pandemic, which brings its own set of stuff. I'll just say that's all. So no, fascinating data. I love it. where right now, kind of what is giving you hope about the future? I hear sometimes, I mean, I've even seen it all in the last couple of months. I mean, there's less people in the US, identifying as Christian for the first time ever. That's less than a majority. The nuns is raising percentage wise, less people going to church. The statistics I hear out there sometimes are very depressing. And so my question is there anything about kind of digital and online church that maybe gives you hope for the future of the church?
Yeah. Maybe I'm misguided because I see all those stories and all that data too. I'm not worried about the church. I think it does have a few years ahead of it that will be challenging. I think it has a lot of figuring out to do. I think the church got really comfortable for a really long time with how it did things. And I use that word did specifically. We got very comfortable with the doing of church, but it's not the doing of church that we're called to. It's the being of church. And I believe that what is happening right now is a deconstruction of the doing so we can focus on the being.
Ooh, I love that.
And I really believe that that's what's happening. And I believe that it's because we focused on the doing for so long that so many people have disconnected. I mean, people, frankly, like me in my early 20s, it didn't make sense to me anymore. It lost its meaning. And I luckily have found meaning in it again through, churches that were really reached out to me and helped me on my own spiritual journey, but not everybody has that. And so, no, I'm not worried. And it does give me hope. I know that this has been a horrible, horrible 18 months or so for many around the world. But I also believe in a God of resurrection. And I believe that the bad is in the process of being resurrected into good. And that some of the good that is going to come out of this is that we're going to learn to be the church again.
Instead of do the church. No, I love that. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. I'm going to be reflecting on that for a while.
Maybe there's a sermon in there or something. I don't know.
I think there is. I think that'll preach, as they say. No, I love it. Well, we are just about out of time, so I have one last question for you. And just in general, is there any particular advice you'd like to leave our listeners with when it comes to digital and online ministry?
Yeah, in fact, it speaks to one of your points about just how new this is to everyone. That is that there are no experts right now.
Yeah.
There are no experts. I get the question in my pre-course surveys all the time, who's doing things that are working? What is working right now? We don't know. Mm-hmm. We can't know. It is all too new, all too unknowable. There are no experts. And again, I think that's a good thing because the church and church leaders had become experts at what they did. And that is what led them to being comfortable in the doing of church. I would encourage them to become explorers. Try things, experiment, fall flat on your faces, and that's okay. And you know what? People connect to explorers. They don't connect to experts. We revere experts. We respect them, but we don't actually journey with them. Your congregations need you to journey with them. They need you to take them with you. Become explorers. And I really believe that your church will become stronger as a result, and you will see real, what's the word that I'm looking for? Transformational ministry happen.
Awesome. What a wonderful last word. That is all the time we have today. I want to say thank you, Christen, for being our guest on How We Do Digital Ministry. I want to invite all of our listeners to follow us in your favorite podcast app or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you'll get notified each week when a new episode drops. Christen, how can our listeners find and follow you online?
Well, thanks for asking. I am at digitalcongregations.com. I am also active on Facebook, but I'll be honest, I like Instagram a whole lot more, and I'm personally more active there. So I would love for you to connect with me on Instagram. Both accounts are at Digital Congregation. So you can find me on social media. You can find me on my website, and I'd love for you to subscribe to my email if that's something that you would like to do. So, but thanks for the question.
You're welcome. And we'll be sure to put links to Instagram and Facebook and your website in the show notes, so y'all can hop over there. And I think I'm going to go subscribe to your email newsletter. I like hearing what other people are doing. So
absolutely.
So I'll go subscribe later today. Once again, to our audience, thank you all for listening. Thank you for taking the time. We'd love to connect with you in another way too. Please ask to join our private Facebook group. It is so cleverly titled How We Do Digital Ministry. The link is in the show notes. It's a good place that for the other 6 days when we do not have a new episode of this podcast, you can discuss all things digital and online ministry with other colleagues around the world. Now we have some international folks in that group. So come and join us in the Facebook group. Until next week, peace and blessings to you all.